And so the next archon, now the archons never went away through all this period. They continued to have their functions. They just were brought down in power. Well, now the archons simply rise back up in power, and you begin to see a new person, Cleisthenes. Cleisthenes was the archon eponymous, or premier archon, or first archon. He was that pinnacle guy. And he is the one, this is the one guy that historians refer to as the father of Athenian democracy. He took it to a whole new level. He established equal rights and equal protections for all Athenian citizens. Here's a big change. He says, this law that we've got, this body of law, it's great, but we need to abolish this whole, if you do something to someone lower than you, he says, that just needs to go away. Now, again, he was from the aristocracy himself, but he was against the privilege of the aristocracy, and he wanted everyone to receive exactly equal treatment under the law, equal opportunities under the law, so everyone at this point could theoretically become an archon. Everyone could theoretically then sit on the Areopagus. Everyone could do any position within the state. So it becomes a situation, and people are being promoted, or being elected, or selected on the basis of their ability rather than on the basis of their popularity within a small group. It's a very important change. And the single biggest obstacle he had was these 4 tribes. The tribal system was still extremely important because the tribes really were what formed the aristocracy. The aristocracy were sort of identified by their tribal affiliations. So that's when he said, all this 4 tribe stuff we've been talking about, that's going away. We're just going to divide the city into 10 pieces, and each of those 10 pieces, you're now a tribe. And it has to do with where you live. It has nothing to do with the power of a particular few people within your group. It has to do with where you live. That's what tribe you belong to. It has not to do with heredity or ethnicity. Okay? So a complete change in that respect. An interesting thing that he did within that is then he broke all of those tribes, which were geographic, down into something called demes. And there were 139 demes in Athens at this point when he broke it all down. And every male, 18 and older, had to register with his deme. So he had to basically become a registered citizen, even though he was not yet a full citizen. He had to register. And so at this point, we start to see really good, accurate figures of how many people there were in Athens, what their jobs were, what they were doing, who their parentage, all of that sort of thing. We start to see really phenomenal records. Something like this had never existed in the ancient world. And so this is a huge stride forward. Well, then in 462, we get into, and again, all this is BC, 462, we get into another guy, Effialtus. Now, Effialtus is, if Cleisthenes is the father of Athenian democracy, he's the father of it in principle or in idea. Effialtus is the guy who actually takes it into a practical next step. He increases the power of the ecclesia by diminishing the power of the Areopagus. So the Areopagus, even though it was freely chosen and anyone was eligible, it was still dominated by the wealthy. And he says, yeah, fine, you guys still have a place. Your wisdom, your connections, that all has a place. But what you're now going to become is you're going to become a special set of judges. And so he changes the role of the Areopagus. So the Areopagus now only has authority in specific cases of sacrilege and murder and absolutely nothing else. So they weren't just focusing on that. They were now limited to that. And they had absolutely no lawmaking authority. They had no other authority whatsoever. And at the same time, the ecclesia is lifted and raised to now this is basically the equivalent of what we would call our House and Senate in U.S. politics. These were the people that made the laws. They passed the laws. They implemented the laws. And it was, again, drawn from the people, from all the people, from all ranks. And so This is the period in which we call 462. So, 5th century BC, this is what we call the pinnacle of the Athenian democracy. This is where they are the most democratic. And that's going along really well, but we have suddenly this thing, the Peloponnesian War. Okay, Peloponnesian War, some of you remember, some of you don't. Thucydides writes this great book, the Peloponnesian War, and in much of the book, Thucydides seems to be putting his own words into other people's mouths. He's a general in his own right, and he's looking at everything, and he's a very thoughtful person, but he's also a very honest historian. He doesn't sugarcoat things. He writes down just what happens, who was where, whatever. Some of it, like the Melian dialogue and things like that, he has to make up some specific words, but the idea of what is discussed is what he puts down, and it's phenomenal. Considered one of the first truly great, if not the first truly great pieces of historical writing. Okay, so what happens in this? We've got this war going on between Athens and Sparta, and all of Macedon and all of Attica and all of the whole area here of the Greek peninsula, the Greek islands. This is all being caught up in this struggle. And it goes back and forth, and they kind of hit a position of stalemate until they suddenly have a couple of charismatic leaders who rise up, and they say, we have an idea. And we're going to pick that up in a little while. I'm not going to flesh that out thoroughly yet, but just bear in mind that the Peloponnesian War becomes a turning point. And specifically, within the Peloponnesian War, it's this event called the Sicilian Campaign, or the Sicilian Expedition. And that's the point at which democracy truly fails. So what happens after that? The first thing that happens is the democracy is overthrown, and you have something called the oligarchy of the Council of 400. Remember the Council of 400, the bull doesn't have a whole lot of power, the bulle. They don't really have a whole lot of power. All of a sudden, they raise themselves up and say, we have the power. We are the power. And they take the power away from the ecclesia, and they basically become a ruling body over Athens. So it becomes completely non-democratic. But because of the Sicilian Campaign and the disaster that happens with that, Athens is overrun by Sparta, and Sparta institutes leaders, and they're Greeks. They are from Athens. They're Athenians, but they are Athenians that are favorable towards Sparta. And so these people, these 30 individuals they appoint to basically rule Athens, are called the 30 Tyrants. Again, probably not properly named. They're really oligarchs, not tyrants. But that was the name that was given them, and that's the name that they're known by historically. So that goes on for a little while. Then a whole new thing happens. Macedonia rises up. Philip II. Philip II takes over the rest of the Greek peninsula. He becomes the first real conqueror in the area. Now, Greece had tried very hard to extend its power, but it wasn't really conquering. It was conquering in the sense of taking over trade, but it was not taking over lands. Because realistically, you couldn't control much outside of your city in a long-term basis. The cost in terms of troops and things would be exorbitant. So that wasn't the way they operated, but Philip of Macedon did. Philip of Macedon took over the whole area and basically made himself king over all of Greece. He begins the Hellenic period, or the Hellenistic period. We talked about that back in the art. Remember the period after the classical period, the Hellenistic period? That's when we have a single Greekness that's going on. So all of the different powers and players within Greece now have a voice, and it's all becoming more homogenized. And of course, Philip II's son is Alexander the Great. And Alexander pushes the Greek frontier and takes over all sorts of lands. He takes over, as they view it at the time, all of the known world. So everything that was really known to them, which, again, is kind of limited. So it's the Mediterranean and a little bit inland, is about as much as they could call the known world. But nonetheless, it was more than anyone had ever conquered in history at this point in time. So this is what's going on. So what's happening to Athens and Athenian democracy through all of this? Well, they appoint governors. Say, okay, you are now basically a chattel state. You are, that is to say, you're a possession state of Macedon or of Greek writ large. And so you need a governor. You don't get to rule yourselves at all. You're going to be ruled by a governor. And the governors, as they come and go, some will allow more democratic activity, some will have clamp down and allow less. Has a lot to do with the particular politics of what's happening around them at the time. But that's a period in which we see a lot of changes. When we come back, we're going to talk about what happens at the end of this Hellenistic period.